You don't owe me a thing. He would say those 5 words to a starving woman and 3 half-dead children before he understood that he was the one who owed everything, that the debt had been carried across years and rivers and was only now coming due. When a solitary rancher rode out to help strangers he never expected to see again, he had no idea he was riding toward the family he'd buried hope of ever having. This is the story of the Texas Hill Country in 1893, where the rain stopped coming, where kindness cost more than a man could spare, and where the help you give freely has a way of circling back when you least expect it. Stay until the end and comment the name of your town below so I can see how far this story travels. The drought had been killing the hill country slow, the way patient things kill. By the 3rd summer without proper rain, the creeks were nothing but ribbons of cracked white stone, and the cedars had gone the color of old smoke, and the cattle stood in the shrinking shade with their ribs showing like the staves of a barrel. Jonah Hale had watched it happen from the back of his horse, riding the same fence lines he'd ridden for 12 years, and he had survived it better than most because he was careful, and because he was stubborn, and because he had no one left to spend his caution on but himself. His wife had been gone 6 years now, and the child she died trying to bring into the world had gone with her, and Jonah had learned in that time to want very little. A man who wants little can endure a great deal. That was the only piece of wisdom the loss had left him. He kept his spring covered against the heat, rationed his herd's water with the cold arithmetic of a man who'd done it before, and spoke to almost no one for weeks at a stretch. The quiet had stopped feeling like loneliness years ago. It had just become the shape of his days. He found the Bennett place by accident, riding the south boundary after a strayed heifer. He had known a family lived out there, the way you know weather lives somewhere over the hills, without ever seeing it up close. What he saw stopped him in his saddle. The little house sat baking in the sun with its windmill stalled and its garden gone to dust, and a woman was hauling a bucket up from a well by hand, her arms shaking with the effort, and the bucket came up a quarter full of muddy water that wasn't fit for a hog. 3 children watched her from the shade of the porch. They were too thin. He knew that thinness on sight, the way it hollowed a child's cheeks and made their eyes look too big for their faces, and something in him that he'd kept covered a long time turned over once, heavily, like a sleeper waking. The woman saw him and straightened, one hand going to the small of her back, the other lifting to shade her eyes. She didn't call out. She just watched him the way you watch a dog you haven't decided about yet, and Jonah understood that look too. He took his hat off, which he hadn't done for anyone in a while, and rode in slow with his hands where she could see them. "Ma'am," he said, "my name's Jonah Hale. I run cattle north of here. I was after a stray, but it looks like you could use a hand before I worry about a cow." "We're managing," she said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her something to keep it that way. "I'm obliged, Mr. Hale, but we don't need charity." "Didn't offer any," he said. "Your well's failing. Mine isn't. There's a difference between charity and a neighbor with more water than sense, and I've got more water than sense." He nodded toward the dry creek. "I can run a barrel down here by wagon, today if you'll let me. No call to decide anything more than that." She studied him a long moment. Behind her, the smallest child, a boy of maybe 6, came down off the porch and stood against her leg, looking up at Jonah with frank curiosity and no fear at all, the way only the very young can look at a stranger. The woman's hand found the boy's hair. "Clara Bennett," she said at last, "these are my children. We'll take the water, Mr. Hale, and I'll find a way to pay you for it." "You don't owe me a thing," Jonah said. He came back that afternoon with 2 full barrels in the wagon and a sack of feed he told her he'd overbought, which was a lie, and she likely knew it was a lie, and she let it stand because her children needed the feed for the milk cow more than she needed her pride. He stayed long enough to look at the windmill and see what the dust had done to it. The oldest boy, Daniel, 12 and trying hard to carry a man's worry on a boy's shoulders, followed him every step, watching his hands. Jonah recognized that too. He'd been that boy once in a different country, learning to be old before his time. When he rode home that evening, the quiet of his own place felt different than it had that morning, though he couldn't have said how, and he lay awake longer than usual listening to it. He told himself he would not go back more than was decent. A man brought water in a drought. That was all. But the windmill was stalled, and a stalled windmill in that heat was a slow death sentence for everything that lived under it. And so he went back the next week to mend it, and the week after to grease the gears properly. And somewhere in those weeks the going back stopped being a thing he decided and became a thing he simply did. He brought Daniel along the fence and taught him how to read the land for water, where the cedar grew greener and what the deer trails meant, and the boy soaked it up like the dry ground soaked the little rain that finally, stingily, fell. Clara fed him supper the third time, plain beans and cornbread stretched thin, and he ate every bite and praised it like it was the best meal he'd had in years, which in the ways that mattered it was. It was the youngest Asa who first started paying him. Jonah had fixed the gate on the chicken run, a 5-minute job, and the boy had watched the whole thing with his small face screwed up in concentration. And when Jonah finished, Asa marched up to him and held out his fist and dropped a brass button into Jonah's palm. "What's this for?" Jonah asked. "You did work," Asa said, as if it were obvious. "You get paid for work." Jonah looked at the button a moment. Then he closed his hand around it and put it solemnly in his shirt pocket, the one over his heart, and tipped his hat to the boy like he'd been handed a gold piece. "Fair wage," he said. Asa beamed. After that there was no stopping it. A hawk feather for hauling water, a smooth gray river stone for mending the fence, a blue jay's feather, a bit of broken horseshoe, a marble with a crack down the middle. Jonah took everyone and kept everyone. And at home he set them in an old coffee tin on his windowsill. And some nights he caught himself looking at the little hoard and not knowing what to make of the feeling it gave him. Clara found him at the windmill on a still evening when the children were inside and the light was going long and gold over the dead grass. "You ought to know something," she said, "before you spend any more of your kindness on us." She wrapped her arms around herself. "When Henry was alive, we had a bad year. He borrowed against this place to keep us on it. $200 from Silas Crane, the lender in town. Then Henry took sick that winter and died, and the notes come due, and I can't pay it. Not in a drought year, not in any year I can see." She made herself look at him. "Crane's been sending word, asking after the place. He doesn't care about the house, Mr. Hale. He cares that this is the last reliable spring between here and the river. I think he means to take it. I think he's been meaning to take it for a while." Jonah looked out at the failing land that was, even failing, the only green thing for miles. He felt the old caution in him, the voice that said this was not his trouble, that he wanted little and owed nothing, and had survived by keeping it that way. He waited for that voice to win the way it always had. It didn't. The clerk came on a Tuesday, in a town suit gone gray with road dust, riding a horse that had never done a day's real work. His name was Dell, and he had the soft, apologetic manner of a man who has learned to deliver cruelty as though it were weather, something nobody could be blamed for. Jonah happened to be there, unloading feed from the wagon, when Dell rode up and tipped his hat to Clara and produced a folded paper from his coat with the air of a man producing a gift. "Mrs. Bennet, notice of foreclosure on the property per the note held by Mr. Silas Crane." He held it out. When she didn't take it, he set it on the porch rail gently, as if that made it kinder. "The full sum's due in 30 days, principal and accumulated interest, which comes to $460. Failing payment, the property goes to public auction on the courthouse steps." He paused, and his voice softened into something that was supposed to sound like mercy. "Mr. Crane is prepared to spare you all that trouble. He'll buy the place outright. $100 clear and you walk away owing nothing. It's a generous offer, ma'am, considering." $460. Jonah did the arithmetic standing there with a feed sack on his shoulder, and the arithmetic was a lie, and he knew it was a lie. 200 borrowed did not become 460 in a few short years by any honest reckoning. But Clara's face had gone white and still, and the children had gone quiet behind the window glass, and the clerk was already turning his horse, his work done, the cruelty delivered like rain nobody could help. $100, Jonah said, for the last good spring in the county. That's not generosity. That's a man stealing slow enough to call it business. Dell paused. I just carry the papers, friend, he said, not unkindly, and rode away. That night Jonah sat at Clara's table after the children were asleep, and he did the thing he had told himself for years he would never do again. He let someone in. He told her he had savings, more than a careful solitary man had any use for, near $300 put by against a bad year that, for him, had never quite come. He told her he had standing in the county, that men there knew his name and his word, and that standing was worth something against a man like Crane. He told her he would fight this beside her all the way to the courthouse steps if it came to that, and that she would not lose this place while he had breath and $1 left to spend. He did not say the rest of it, the thing that had been growing in him through the long gold evenings, and the suppers stretched thin, and the little hoard of buttons and feathers on his windowsill. But it was in his voice, and Clara heard it, and she looked at him across the lamplight with her eyes bright and her jaw set, and she did not tell him to go home. Why, she asked, you don't know us, you owe us nothing. He had no answer for her then. He only knew that the quiet of his own house had become unbearable, and that this loud, struggling, half-starved family had filled some room in him he'd nailed shut 6 years ago, and that he would burn his savings to ash before he'd let a man like Silas Crane put them out on the road. Let me help you sort Henry's papers, he said instead. If the note's wrong, and I think it's wrong, the proof's in the numbers somewhere. Men like Crane always leave a thread because they never think anyone poor enough will have the strength to pull it. So she brought down the box. It was a plain wooden box, the kind a man keeps the records of his whole small life in, and they went through it together by lamplight, deeds and letters, and a faded daguerreotype of a wedding day, and Jonah's hands were steady until they weren't. Because near the bottom, wrapped in an old kerchief, was a knife, a working knife with a bone handle worn smooth, and into that handle someone had carved 2 letters with the patience of long winter nights. H.B. Jonah stopped breathing. He had seen that knife before. He had seen it in a river 12 years gone, in a different part of the country, on a cattle drive when he was a young fool who thought he could swim a swollen crossing he had no business swimming. He had felt the water take his horse out from under him and pull him down into the brown roar of it, had felt his lungs fill and the cold close over his head, and then a hand had closed in his collar like the hand of God and hauled him up into the air. A stranger. A big man on a tired horse who had gone in after him without a word, who had dragged him gasping to the bank and pounded the water out of him. And then, when Jonah could finally breathe enough to babble his thanks, had only said, "You'd have done the same," and ridden on down the line before Jonah could so much as learn his name. The only thing Jonah ever had of him was a knife the man had dropped in the struggle, a bone-handled working knife with 2 carved letters in it, that Jonah had carried for a year trying to find its owner, and then carried 12 years more because he never could. He still had it. It was in his saddlebag right now. He had carried it across 1,000 miles and 1 marriage and 1 grave, the way you carry the one debt in your life you were never allowed to repay. "Clara," he said, and his voice didn't sound like his own, "this knife, where did Henry get it?" She frowned at it, gentling the way you touch a dead man's things. "He never had that one that I recall. That's odd. He carried a knife just like it for years with his initials in it the same way. He carved them himself the winter we married. But he lost his, years before I knew him. On a cattle drive, he always said. Went in a river after some greenhorn cowboy fool enough to drown himself and saved the boy and lost his good knife doing it. He used to laugh about it. Said he hoped the boy was worth a knife." She looked up and saw Jonah's face, and her own went still. "Mr. Hale, what is it?" He took the twin from his saddlebag. He laid it on the table beside the one from the box. 2 bone handles worn by the same man's hand, HB and HB, and they were a matched pair, carved the same winter by the same patient knife. And one of them had been in a dead man's drawer, and one of them had been over Jonah's heart for 12 years. And Jonah Hale put his face in his hands at the table of strangers who had never once been strangers, and wept like the boy in the river had never let himself weep. He was not helping them. He had it backwards. He had been helping them backwards from the start, paying down without knowing it the one debt he despaired of ever paying, because the man who'd reached into the brown water and given Jonah back his whole life was Henry Bennett. And Henry Bennett's wife was hauling muddy water by hand, and Henry Bennett's children were going hungry in the dust. And a soft little man in a dust-gray suit meant to put them out on the road for the price of a horse. He told Clara everything that night, the river and the hand in his collar and the 12 years. She listened with her hand pressed to her mouth, and when he finished she reached across the 2 knives and took his hand, and neither of them said the word for what had built between them. But it was there now, plain as the matched blades on the table, and it was not going anywhere. In the morning Jonah rode into town a different man than the one who'd ridden out to find a stray heifer. He was done being careful. He went first to Mara Whitfield, who ran the boarding house and the store, and in every way that counted, the town itself, and who had a long memory for who'd been decent to her over the years and who hadn't. Jonah had been decent. He told her the whole of it, the note and the lie in the numbers and the auction coming, and Mara listened with her arms folded and her mouth getting harder by the minute, because she had watched Silas Crane do this before, to the Proots and to the widow Acker, slow theft dressed in a clean collar, and no one had ever had the standing or the stomach to pull the thread. $200 doesn't grow to $460 in 3 years, she said. Not honest. He's stacking interest on interest and calling it law. The trouble's always been proving it. His books are his books. She looked at Jonah with a slow smile starting. But the county recorder logs every payment made against a registered note. If Henry ever paid down so much as $1, there's a record of it and Crane has to credit it. And if Crane never credited it, then Crane's note is fraud on its face. They went to the recorder's office together, Jonah and Mara and Clara, and they had the clerk pull the file on the Bennett note. And there, it was in the ledger in faded ink. A payment of $70 logged the spring before Henry took sick. $70 Henry had scraped together and carried to town and paid, and that Silas Crane had simply never subtracted, had buried, had gone on charging interest as though the money had never been paid at all. $70 and the illegal interest piled on top of it. And when the recorder and Mara and an old retired lawyer Mara dragged out of his porch chair sat down and did the honest arithmetic, the true sum left on the note was not $460. It was $61. Jonah had 300 in a tin under his floorboards, but it was not about the money now and had not been for some time. It was about the thing being true, and about a man who'd been stealing slow for years standing up in front of the county and being made to account. Word travels in a small place faster than any rider. By the time foreclosure day came, the courthouse steps were not empty the way Silas Crane liked them. The Proots were there, who'd lost their place to him and never forgotten it. The widow Acker was there. Mara Whitfield was there with half the town at her back. And the old lawyer was there with the recorder's certified ledger in his hand, and Clara stood on those steps with her 3 children and her chin up, and Jonah Hale stood beside her, and for once in 12 careful years, he was exactly where he meant to be. Crane came in his good coat with his clerk Dell trailing behind, and he had the auctioneer with him, and he had that look on his smooth face of a man who has done this so many times it has stopped feeling like anything at all. He didn't see what he was walking into. He stood up on the steps and had the auctioneer read the notice and call for the sale of the Bennett property to settle a debt of $460. And the crowd that should have been a scatter of the curious was instead a wall, silent and unmoving, and Crane's smile flickered for the first time. The old lawyer stepped forward before the first bid could be called and held up the certified ledger and read out, in a voice cracked with age but carrying clear across the square, The payment of $70 logged in the county's own hand against this note, never credited by its holder. He read out the legal rate of interest a registered note could carry in the state of Texas, and then he read out the rate Silas Crane had charged, and the gap between the two was the gap between a businessman and a thief, and everyone standing on those steps could do the arithmetic now, because the old man laid it out slow enough for a child to follow. The true balance, he said, was $61. The note as written was fraud. And fraud, he said, looking Silas Crane dead in the eye, did not foreclose on anybody in this county while he was still breathing to say so. Crane tried for a moment the old way. He drew himself up and spoke of contracts and his rights and the sanctity of a debt freely entered. But the crowd had found its voice now, low and growling, and the recorder confirmed the ledger was the county's true record. And Mara Whitfield said loud enough for all to hear that maybe the county ought to look at the Prout note too, and the Acker note, and every note Silas Crane had ever called due. And at that the color went out of the lender's face entirely, because he knew what was in those books, and he knew it would not survive the looking. He stood on the steps with the whole town's eyes on him and saw, finally and far too late, that the slow theft was over, that he had stolen one family too many and from the wrong one, and that there was no clean collar in the world that could dress it up now. He gathered his papers with shaking hands and he left, and his clerk Dell did not follow him, and Silas Crane was never again the man he had been in that town. Jonah paid the $61 on the spot in honest coin and took the receipt, and the Bennett place was saved. Not by charity, by the truth, and by a town that remembered who had been kind, which is its own slow ledger that always, in the end, gets balanced. They were married in the fall, when the rains finally came back the way rain does, all at once and forgiving everything, greening the dead hills overnight. Mara Whitfield laid out the supper and half the county came, the Prouts and the widow Acker and the old lawyer, and Daniel stood up beside Jonah grave as a deacon, and Lottie wore flowers in her hair, and Asa was given the solemn duty of carrying the ring and nearly lost it twice. Jonah Hale, who had wanted little for so long, stood under a clearing sky and married into more than he had ever let himself want, and could not for the life of him remember why he had been so careful. The years came on the way they do, kinder now. The spring never failed them. Daniel grew tall and stayed on the land. Lottie married a good man 2 valleys over and taught the local children their letters. Asa grew up never doubting for one day that he was loved, which is the only inheritance that finally matters. And in time there were 2 more children with Clara, so that the table Henry Bennett had built was crowded again, loud again, full again, the way Jonah supposed a good man would have wanted it. On the windowsill of the house, where the light came in long and gold of an evening, there sat an old coffee tin, and in the tin was a brass button and a hawk feather and a smooth gray river stone and a blue jay's feather and a cracked marble, and 100 small worthless treasures. A little boy had once paid a lonely stranger for his work, 1 piece at a time. Jonah kept them all his life. Some evenings Asa, grown now, would catch his father turning them over in his big rough hands, and he never asked why, because he had come to understand, the way you understand the deep things slowly, that nothing his father ever gave away for free had been wasted, that every kindness had been a coin paid into a ledger no bank could keep, and that it had all come back, every cent of it in the end. Beside the tin, where Clara had set them the day they married and where they stayed for the rest of their lives, lay 2 bone-handled knives worn smooth by the same patient hand, HB and HB. The matched pair finally come home. The man who carved them had reached into a brown river 12 years before he died and given a drowning stranger his whole life back, and never knew that he had, and never lived to see it repaid. But it was repaid. It was repaid in water carried through a drought, and a windmill mended, and a family kept off the road, and a grave's worth of grief turned somehow into a house full of children. You'd have done the same, the dead man had said once, on a riverbank and ridden on. Jonah Hale spent the rest of his days proving him right. The end.